Picture this. You're 6 days old, lying helpless in silk swaddling clothes, when suddenly the weight of an entire kingdom crashes down on your tiny shoulders. You can't even lift your head, yet nobles are already kneeling before you, calling you Your Majesty. Your father has just died, and through no choice of your own, you've become the youngest monarch in Scottish history. The crown they place above your infant head weighs more than your entire body, and the political vultures circling your cradle are already plotting to use you as a pawn in their deadly games of power. This was the reality for Mary Stuart, born into a world that would give her everything except the one thing every child deserves: a childhood. From the moment she drew her first breath in a 1542, her life belonged not to her, but to the ambitions of kings, the schemes of regents, and the brutal calculations of Renaissance politics. She would be married off as a toddler, exiled from her homeland as a child, and transformed into a political weapon before she was old enough to understand what any of it meant. Before diving into this heartbreaking story of innocence destroyed by power, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these tragic stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Mary's story begins not with joy, but with desperation and impending doom. She was born on December 8, 1542, at Linlithgow Palace in Scotland, entering a world already convulsing with violence and political chaos. Her father, King James V, lay dying in his chambers at Falkland Palace, his body broken not by disease but by the crushing weight of military defeat and personal humiliation. Just weeks earlier, his army had been decimated by English forces at the Battle of Solway Moss, a catastrophe so complete that it shattered James's will to live. When word reached the dying king that his wife had given birth to a daughter, his response wasn't celebration but prophecy. "It cam wi' a lass, and it will gang wi' a lass," he reportedly said, referring to how the Stuart dynasty had come to the throne through Marjorie Bruce, and predicting it would end with his newborn daughter. James V turned his face to the wall and died 6 days later, leaving behind a kingdom in chaos and an infant daughter who would inherit his crown before she could even focus her eyes. The circumstances of Mary's birth were ominous in ways that would prove prophetic. She was said to have been born prematurely, a fragile child entering a world that would show her no mercy. Her mother, Mary of Guise, was French, a detail that would shape every aspect of Mary's future, but also mark her as foreign in the eyes of many Scots. From her very first breath, Mary was caught between two worlds, two religions, and two powerful nations that would spend her entire childhood fighting over control of her person and her kingdom. The moment James V died, Scotland exploded into factional warfare that would define Mary's early years. As an infant, she obviously couldn't rule, which meant that powerful men would fight for the right to control her, and, through her, Scotland itself. Two main claimants emerged for the regency: Cardinal David Beaton, representing the Catholic faction that wanted to maintain Scotland's traditional alliance with France, and the Earl of Arran, who led the Protestant nobles favoring closer ties with England. Cardinal Beaton claimed to possess James V's will, naming him as regent and guardian of the infant queen. His opponents dismissed this document as a forgery, and the dispute quickly turned violent. The Earl of Arran, who was next in line to the throne after Mary, secured control of the government with the support of Protestant nobles and English gold. But this was no peaceful transition of power. It was a hostile takeover that would make Mary a prisoner in her own kingdom. Imagine being 9 months old and having your coronation ceremony. On September 9th, 1543, Mary was carried into the Chapel Royal at Stirling Castle for one of the most surreal ceremonies in royal history. Cardinal Beaton held the massive Scottish crown over her tiny head, while she was anointed with holy oil and blessed according to ancient tradition. The infant queen had her own opinion about these proceedings. She screamed and wailed throughout the entire ceremony, forcing the officials to cut short the traditional rituals. The image is both heartbreaking and absurd. A crying baby surrounded by men in elaborate robes, holding symbols of power that weighed more than she did, proclaiming her sovereign over a kingdom she couldn't even see clearly. But this wasn't just ceremony, it was desperation. The Scottish nobles needed to legitimize Mary's rule as quickly as possible because powerful enemies were already plotting to steal her crown and her kingdom. Chief among these enemies was Henry VIII of England, who saw in the infant Scottish queen an opportunity to unite the British Isles under English rule. His plan was breathtakingly cynical. He would force Mary to marry his young son Edward, bringing Scotland under English control through what he called diplomatic marriage, but what was really legalized kidnapping. When Mary was just 6 months old, Henry's ambassadors arrived in Scotland with the Treaty of Greenwich, which promised that at age 10, Mary would be sent to England to be raised in Henry's court until her marriage to Edward. The treaty was a trap disguised as diplomacy. Henry knew that once he had physical control of Mary, he could shape her education, her religion, and her loyalties to serve English interests. She would become Scottish in name only, a puppet queen, who would hand her kingdom over to England without a single battle being fought. The English king was essentially demanding that Scotland surrender its independence and its queen in exchange for peace. Mary's mother, Mary of Guise, understood exactly what Henry's offer really meant. She had not married into the Scottish royal family and endured years of political chaos just to watch her infant daughter become an English captive. When the Scottish Parliament rejected the Treaty of Greenwich in December 1543, Henry VIII's response revealed his true nature. If Scotland wouldn't give him Mary willingly, he would take her by force. What followed was one of the most brutal military campaigns in Scottish history, euphemistically called the Rough Wooing, but which was really an 8-year reign of terror designed to force a 6-month-old baby into marriage. Henry unleashed his armies on Scotland with instructions to capture Mary at all costs and devastate the country until its people begged for mercy. English forces swept across the border, burning cities, destroying crops, and slaughtering civilians in a campaign of systematic brutality. The Earl of Hertford, Henry's military commander, received orders that read like something from a medieval horror story. Put all to fire and sword. Burn Edinburgh town, so razed and defaced when you have sacked and gotten what ye can of it, as there may remain forever a perpetual memory of the vengeance of God, lightened upon them for their falsehood and disloyalty. The English weren't just waging war, they were trying to erase Scotland from the map. For little Mary, this meant a childhood spent as a fugitive in her own kingdom. She was moved constantly from castle to castle, always one step ahead of English raiders who had orders to capture her alive. Her guardians lived in constant terror that she would be seized and carried off to England, where Henry could raise her as an English princess and use her to legitimize his conquest of Scotland. In May 1544, when Mary was barely 18 months old, English forces attacked Edinburgh itself. The city was burned, its ancient buildings reduced to ash and rubble, while Mary was rushed to Dunkeld for safety. The infant queen's earliest memories would have been of frantic journeys through the Scottish countryside, of adults speaking in whispered, frightened voices, of being held close while the sky glowed red from burning towns. The violence reached its crescendo in September 1547 at the Battle of Pinkie, where Scottish forces suffered a catastrophic defeat that left the country defenseless. Mary was 5 years old when news reached her guardians that English armies were advancing on all fronts, and that Scotland's military resistance had collapsed. In desperation, her protectors smuggled her to Inchmahome Priory, a remote island monastery where she could be hidden from English search parties. Picture a 5-year-old girl, already bearing the title of queen, being rowed across dark waters to a tiny island where monks would hide her from armies that wanted to kidnap her. This wasn't an adventure. It was trauma. Mary spent weeks on that isolated island, surrounded by men in religious robes, knowing that somewhere beyond the water soldiers were hunting for her. She was old enough to understand danger, but too young to comprehend why she was the target of such desperate pursuit. The defeat at Pinkie forced Mary's guardians to make a heartbreaking decision. Scotland could no longer protect its queen from English aggression. If Mary was to survive and retain any hope of ruling Scotland as an independent nation, she would have to be sent away from her homeland, perhaps forever. The only power strong enough to protect her from Henry VIII was France, Scotland's traditional ally, and England's greatest enemy. Mary's mother, Mary of Guise, faced an impossible choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She could keep her daughter close and risk seeing her captured by the English, or she could send Mary to safety in France, knowing she might never see her child again. The political calculation was clear. France offered protection that Scotland could no longer provide. But the human cost was devastating. In July 1548, when Mary was 5 years old, French ships arrived on the Scottish coast to carry her away from everything she had ever known. The little queen was accompanied by her own miniature court, her illegitimate half-brothers, her governess Lady Fleming, and 4 girls her own age, all named Mary, who were daughters of Scotland's noble families. These companions, known to history as the Four Marys, would be her only connection to Scotland during the long years of exile that lay ahead. The farewell between mother and daughter was conducted in secrecy, with Mary of Guise knowing that this might be the last time she would ever hold her child. Political necessity demanded the separation, but human nature made it agony. Mary was too young to understand that she was being sent away for her own protection. She only knew that she was leaving her mother, her home, and everything familiar. The journey to France was itself a trauma for a 5-year-old child. Medieval sea travel was dangerous under the best circumstances, but Mary was being smuggled out of Scotland while English ships patrolled the waters, looking for exactly this kind of escape attempt. She spent days in a cramped ship's cabin, seasick and frightened, as adult voices discussed the political implications of her flight, while offering little comfort to the child at the center of their plans. When Mary finally arrived at the French court, she entered a world of unimaginable luxury that masked the fundamental tragedy of her situation. The French royal family welcomed her with elaborate ceremonies and treated her as a precious guest, but she was essentially a refugee who could never safely return home. The gilded halls of French palaces were beautiful prisons for a child who had been torn away from her natural environment and thrust into a foreign culture. Henry II of France and his wife Catherine de' Medici had their own plans for Mary that were only slightly less cynical than Henry VIII's schemes. They intended to marry her to their son Francis the Dauphin, making her Queen of France while using her claim to the Scottish throne to advance French interests. Mary would be educated, refined, and transformed into a perfect French princess, but always with the understanding that her primary value lay in what she could provide to French ambitions. The French court was a dangerous place for a child, filled with intrigue, shifting alliances, and adults who viewed children as political assets rather than human beings deserving of protection and love. Catherine de' Medici, in particular, never warmed to Mary, seeing her as a potential threat to her own children's inheritance. The young Scottish queen had to navigate these treacherous waters while still processing the trauma of separation from her mother and homeland. Mary's education in France was comprehensive and sophisticated, but it was also designed to erase her Scottish identity and replace it with French loyalties. She learned to speak French as her primary language, studied Latin, Greek, Italian, and Spanish, and mastered the arts of music, dancing, and needlework that were considered essential for a Renaissance princess. But with each passing year, she became more French and less Scottish, more prepared to rule France than to govern the kingdom she had inherited as an infant. The tragedy was that Mary excelled in this artificial environment. She was intelligent, charming, and beautiful, quickly becoming a favorite at the French court. But her success came at the cost of her connection to Scotland and her understanding of the people she was supposed to rule. She was being prepared for a life that would take her further away from her birthright rather than closer to it. As Mary grew from child to adolescent in the French court, the political situation in Scotland continued to deteriorate. Her mother, Mary of Guise, had assumed the regency and was fighting a desperate battle to preserve Scottish independence against English aggression and Protestant rebellion. The woman who had sacrificed her relationship with her daughter to protect Mary's throne was slowly dying under the stress of trying to hold Scotland together for a queen who might never return. The separation between mother and daughter became a source of constant anguish for both women. Mary of Guise received reports of her daughter's progress in France, how she was growing tall and beautiful, how she excelled in her studies, how she charmed everyone she met. But these updates only emphasize the distance between them and the life they might have shared if political circumstances had been different. Mary, for her part, wrote dutiful letters to her mother but grew increasingly French in her outlook and attachments. She was forming deep friendships with French nobles, particularly with Elizabeth of Valois, who became like a sister to her. But these relationships, however genuine, were built on the foundation of her exile from Scotland and her separation from her family. The betrothal to Francis, the Dauphin of France, was formalized when Mary was still a child, sealing her fate as a future Queen of France rather than an active ruler of Scotland. The engagement was celebrated with elaborate ceremonies that emphasized Mary's value as a diplomatic prize rather than her rights as an individual. She was being prepared for a marriage that would serve French interest while potentially abandoning Scottish independence forever. As Mary approached her teenage years, the full tragedy of her childhood began to crystallize. She had been robbed of her parents, her homeland, and her natural development as a Scottish queen. Instead, she had been transformed into a beautiful, accomplished French princess whose primary loyalty was to a foreign court that had given her everything except the one thing she had lost: her identity as a Scot and her connection to the people she was born to serve. The little girl who had cried during her coronation at 9 months old had grown into a young woman who barely remembered Scotland, spoke French better than Scots, and was being prepared for a destiny that would make her Queen of France, while potentially making her a stranger to her own subjects. Her childhood had been stolen by politics, and the consequences would shape not only her own tragic fate, but the future of Scotland itself. The French court may have provided Mary with safety from English armies, but it created new forms of psychological imprisonment that would prove just as damaging to her development. At 15, Mary was presented with documents that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Secret treaties that essentially signed away Scotland's independence before she was old enough to truly understand their implications. On April 4, 1558, in a private ceremony hidden from Scottish eyes, Mary put her signature to agreements that betrayed everything her mother was fighting to preserve. These documents declared that if Mary died without children, Scotland and her claim to the English throne would pass directly to the French crown. The French king would also control all Scottish revenues until his debts for protecting and educating Mary were repaid. It was the ultimate price for her childhood refuge, the potential sale of her entire kingdom. Imagine being a teenager and signing away your birthright, your people's freedom, and centuries of Scottish independence with a few strokes of a pen. Mary was surrounded by French advisors who assured her this was merely a formality, a legal precaution that would never come to pass. But the documents contained clauses specifically stating they could never be overturned by any future agreements, making them as permanent as carved stone. The tragedy wasn't just that Mary signed these treaties, it was that she had been so thoroughly conditioned by her French upbringing that she may not have fully grasped what she was surrendering. The 5-year-old who had been smuggled out of Scotland to save her throne had grown into a 15-year-old who was potentially signing that throne away. Her protectors had become her manipulators, using her gratitude and dependence to secure advantages that no Scottish Parliament would ever have granted. 20 days after signing these secret documents, Mary married Francis, the Dauphin of France, in a ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral that was magnificent in its pageantry but hollow in its humanity. She was 16 years old, beautiful and accomplished, walking down the aisle toward a boy who was sickly, stuttering, and physically weak. The contrast between them was striking. Mary had grown to nearly 6 feet tall, an imposing figure who commanded attention wherever she went, while Francis remained small and frail, looking more like her younger brother than her husband. The marriage ceremony itself was a masterpiece of political theater designed to celebrate the alliance between France and Scotland while completely ignoring the human cost. Mary wore a crown of gold set with precious stones, her train carried by French duchesses, while crowds cheered outside the cathedral. But this wasn't a fairy tale wedding. It was the final step in transforming a Scottish queen into a French political asset. Contemporary observers noted that while Mary smiled and played her part perfectly, there was something melancholy in her demeanor, as if she understood that this marriage marked the end of any possibility of returning to the Scotland of her birth. She was now bound to France not just by gratitude and education, but by sacred vows that made her French interests her primary concern. The wedding night and early months of marriage revealed new traumas that no one had prepared Mary to face. Francis was not only physically weak but emotionally immature, more interested in hunting and games than in the intimate responsibilities of marriage. Mary found herself married to someone who was more like a dependent child than a partner, creating a loneliness that was different from anything she had experienced before. Court physicians and observers whispered about the marriage's lack of consummation, but for Mary, this represented another form of isolation. She had been educated to believe that her primary duty was to produce heirs who would secure the alliance between France and Scotland. When that fundamental purpose remained unfulfilled month after month, she began to question not just her marriage, but her entire value as a political asset. The pressure to conceive became overwhelming as French courtiers and Scottish ambassadors watched for any sign that Mary might be carrying the child who would cement the alliance between the two kingdoms. Every monthly cycle became a public disappointment, every appearance scrutinized for hints of pregnancy. Mary was learning that even in marriage, her body belonged not to herself but to the political calculations of others. Meanwhile, in Scotland, her mother, Mary of Guise, was fighting an increasingly desperate battle to preserve the kingdom for a daughter who seemed to be drifting further away with each passing year. The Protestant Reformation had reached Scotland with explosive force, and Mary of Guise found herself defending not just Scottish independence, but the Catholic faith that Mary had been raised to embrace in France. The irony was heartbreaking. Mary of Guise was sacrificing her health, her happiness, and ultimately her life to preserve a Catholic Scotland for a daughter who was becoming more French than Scottish with each passing day. The woman who had sent her child away to protect her throne was now fighting alone against enemies who grew stronger, while her daughter danced in French ballrooms and spoke French at French tables. Letters between mother and daughter during this period reveal the growing distance between them, not just in miles, but in understanding and loyalty. Mary wrote dutiful reports about her marriage and her life at court, but her letters were increasingly formal, written more like diplomatic correspondence than personal communications between mother and child. She described French customs and French politics with enthusiasm, while showing little interest in the religious and political struggles tearing Scotland apart. Mary of Guise's letters, by contrast, grew more desperate as she tried to maintain her daughter's connection to Scotland, while managing crises that threatened to destroy the kingdom entirely. She wrote of Protestant rebels who denied Mary's authority, of English gold financing Scottish traders, of the constant struggle to maintain the Catholic faith that Mary had been raised to defend. But these urgent appeals seemed to have little impact on a daughter who was living in luxury while her mother fought for survival. The emotional toll on Mary of Guise was devastating. She had given up her relationship with her child to protect Mary's political future. But now that future seemed to be slipping away as Mary became more French and less Scottish with each passing year. The sacrifice that had once seemed necessary was beginning to look like a tragic mistake that had cost her both her daughter and her kingdom. In 1559, when Mary was 16, her world shifted dramatically with the sudden death of King Henry II of France in a tournament accident. A splinter from a broken lance pierced the king's helmet and entered his brain, killing him slowly and agonizingly over several days. His death elevated Francis to the throne as Francis II, making Mary Queen of France as well as Scotland. but it also exposed her to new dangers and uncertainties. Catherine de' Medici, who had never liked Mary, suddenly found herself in a position of enormous power as the mother of the new king. The woman who had viewed Mary with suspicion and resentment for years was now the most influential person at court, and her hostility toward the young Scottish queen was no longer hidden behind diplomatic courtesy. Mary's elevation to Queen of France should have been the triumph of her French education and political preparation. At 17, she was one of the most powerful women in Europe, queen of two kingdoms and married to the King of France. But the reality was far different from the appearance. Francis was even less capable as king than he had been as Dauphin, relying entirely on his mother's guidance while Mary found herself increasingly isolated and powerless. The French court that had once celebrated Mary as a charming princess now viewed her with calculation and suspicion. She was no longer a delightful child to be educated and refined. She was a foreign queen whose loyalties were questioned and whose influence was feared. Catherine de' Medici made it clear that Mary's position depended entirely on her ability to produce an heir who would strengthen French claims to Scotland. The pressure to conceive became unbearable as Mary realized that her entire future hung on her ability to fulfill this one biological function. She was surrounded by physicians, courtiers, and advisors who monitored her monthly cycles, analyzed her diet, and offered increasingly desperate remedies for what they saw as her failure to conceive. The young woman who had once been celebrated for her intelligence and accomplishments was now reduced to her reproductive capacity. When Francis fell seriously ill in late 1560, Mary faced the terrifying possibility that she might become a widow before her 18th birthday. The sickly king, who had never been a true husband, was dying of what appeared to be an ear infection that had spread to his brain. As Mary watched her husband's condition deteriorate, she understood that his death would leave her completely vulnerable in a court that had never truly accepted her. Francis II died on December 5, 1560, after reigning for barely a year. Mary, still 2 months shy of her 18th birthday, found herself a widow in a foreign court where her presence was no longer welcome or desired. The death of her husband marked the end of her French dream and the beginning of a nightmare that would force her to confront the consequences of her childhood exile. Catherine de' Medici wasted no time in making Mary's position clear. As regent for her younger son, Charles IX, Catherine had no use for a Scottish queen dowager who might complicate her own children's inheritance. Mary was given a pension and treated with formal courtesy, but the message was unmistakable. Her time in France was over. The young woman who had been sent to France as a 5-year-old refugee now faced the prospect of returning to a Scotland she barely remembered as an 18-year-old stranger. The kingdom she had inherited as an infant had been transformed by religious revolution and political upheaval during her 13-year absence. The Catholic Scotland her mother had tried to preserve was gone, replaced by a Protestant nation that viewed their Catholic queen with suspicion and hostility. Most tragically, Mary would never see her mother again. Mary of Guise had died in June 1560, 6 months before Francis, worn out by years of fighting to preserve a kingdom for a daughter who had become a foreigner. The woman who had sacrificed everything for Mary's future had died alone in Edinburgh Castle, never knowing whether her daughter would return to claim the inheritance she had fought so desperately to protect. The news of her mother's death reached Mary just as she was grappling with widowhood and the collapse of her French life. She had lost the only parent she had ever really known without having the chance to reconcile or even to say goodbye. The 5-year-old who had been torn from her mother's arms had grown into a young woman who would never have the opportunity to heal that fundamental wound. As 1561 dawned, Mary faced impossible choices that would determine not just her own fate, but the future of Scotland itself. She could remain in France as a powerless widow, forgotten by history and irrelevant to the great events of her time. Or she could return to Scotland and attempt to rule a kingdom that had become foreign to her, where her religion was despised, her French education was viewed with suspicion, and her very legitimacy was questioned by Protestant rebels. The childhood that had begun with a 6-day-old infant inheriting a crown was about to conclude with an 18-year-old woman facing the impossible task of reclaiming a kingdom that had learned to survive without her. The political calculations that had shaped every moment of her young life had created a tragic paradox. She had been saved from English conquest only to become a stranger to her own people. The little girl who had cried during her coronation at 9 months old was about to discover that all the tears of her childhood had been merely preparation for the greater sorrows that awaited her as an adult. Her tragic childhood was ending, but her tragic reign was about to begin. And the lessons learned in French exile would prove to be poor preparation for the brutal realities of Scottish politics. Mary's return to Scotland in August 1561 wasn't a homecoming. It was the arrival of a beautiful stranger who happened to wear a crown. The ship that carried her across the North Sea might as well have been a time machine, transporting her from the Renaissance splendor of France to a country that had been transformed by religious revolution and political upheaval during her 13-year absence. The Scotland she remembered from childhood memories existed only in her dreams. The fog that shrouded the port of Leith as Mary's ship approach seemed symbolic of the uncertainty that awaited her. Contemporary accounts describe how the mist was so thick that her arrival went almost unnoticed, a stark contrast to the elaborate ceremonies that had marked every significant moment of her French life. There were no cheering crowds, no fanfare, no celebration of their queen's return. Instead, there was an eerie silence that spoke volumes about how Scotland had learned to function without her. When Mary finally stepped onto Scottish soil for the first time in 13 years, she was walking into a country that viewed her with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and barely concealed hostility. The tall, elegant young woman in French silks and jewels looked nothing like the people she was supposed to rule. Her accent was French, her mannerisms were foreign, and her Catholic faith marked her as an enemy of the Protestant Revolution that had swept Scotland in her absence. The Scotland Mary discovered was a harsh, austere nation, shaped by the teachings of John Knox and other Protestant reformers, who preached that her religion was not just wrong, but actively evil. The beautiful Catholic churches she might have remembered from childhood had been stripped of their ornaments, their altars destroyed, their priests driven away or killed. The religious culture that had shaped her French education was now illegal in her own kingdom. More personally devastating was the discovery that she was truly an orphan in every sense of the word. The castle where she had been born was empty of family, empty of anyone who remembered her as a child rather than as a political symbol. The servants who had cared for her as an infant were dead or scattered. The courtiers who had surrounded her cradle were gone, replaced by stern Protestant lords who looked at her with calculating eyes and spoke to her in tones that barely disguised their contempt. Mary's attempts to establish her authority were met with resistance that ranged from passive non-compliance to open defiance. When she requested that Mass be celebrated in the private chapel of Holyrood Palace, not as a public statement, but simply so she could practice her own faith, Protestant mobs gathered outside, shouting threats and demanding that she abandon her papist superstitions. The young woman who had been raised to believe that her authority came from God discovered that her subjects considered her religion proof that she was God's enemy. The psychological impact of this rejection was devastating for someone who had spent her entire life being told she was special, chosen, destined for greatness. Mary had been raised in the French court to believe that she was inherently superior to her subjects, that her royal blood made her different from and better than ordinary people. Now she faced the reality that many of her subjects viewed her not as their divinely appointed ruler, but as a foreign intruder who threatened their religious freedom and national independence. The loneliness Mary experienced in Scotland was different from anything she had endured in France. In the French court, she had at least been welcomed and valued, even if she was ultimately expendable. In Scotland, she was surrounded by people who spoke her language, but who remained fundamentally alien to her experience and worldview. She was a Catholic queen in a Protestant nation, a French-educated monarch among people who viewed French influence as a threat to Scottish independence. Her attempts to connect with her subjects often backfired in ways that revealed just how foreign she had become. When Mary tried to demonstrate her Scottish identity by wearing traditional Highland dress, she was mocked for treating her own culture like a costume. When she attempted to speak Scots rather than French, her accent and vocabulary revealed how thoroughly her native language had been replaced by foreign learning. Every gesture intended to show her connection to Scotland instead emphasized her alienation from it. The political reality of Mary's position was even more brutal than the cultural challenges. She discovered that during her absence, Scotland had developed a form of government that severely limited royal power and made the crown dependent on the approval of Protestant lords who viewed her as a temporary inconvenience rather than their legitimate ruler. The absolute monarchy she had observed in France was impossible in a Scotland where nobles had grown accustomed to ruling in her name while completely ignoring her interests. Mary's council meetings became exercises in frustration and humiliation as she sat through discussions conducted in languages of law and tradition that she barely understood, listening to men debate policies that would affect her kingdom, while treating her input as irrelevant. These advisors had managed Scottish affairs for years without her interference, and they made it clear that they saw no reason to change their methods now that she had returned. The young queen, who had been trained to charm and manipulate the sophisticated courtiers of France, found herself powerless against the blunt resistance of Scottish nobles, who cared nothing for her French accomplishments, and viewed her education as evidence of her unfitness to rule. They were not impressed by her ability to speak multiple languages, her musical talents, or her mastery of courtly etiquette. They wanted a ruler who understood Scottish law, Scottish customs, and Scottish interests, none of which she had been taught during her years of exile. Even Mary's physical appearance worked against her in Scotland. Her height and elegant bearing, which had made her a commanding presence in French ballrooms, marked her as conspicuously foreign among her shorter, more roughly dressed Scottish subjects. Her elaborate French gowns and jewels seemed excessive and inappropriate in a country where Protestant values emphasized simplicity and where many of her subjects lived in poverty that her French education had never prepared her to understand or address. The religious dimension of Mary's alienation created daily conflicts that made normal royal functions almost impossible to perform. She could not attend Protestant services without betraying her Catholic faith, but her absence from these ceremonies was interpreted as evidence that she rejected her subjects' religion, and, by extension, her subjects themselves. When she did appear at Protestant gatherings, her obvious discomfort and inability to participate in the rituals made her seem like an unwilling visitor rather than a committed ruler. Mary's personal relationships suffered as much as her political ones. The young woman who had formed deep friendships with French nobles found it almost impossible to connect with Scottish courtiers who viewed intimacy with their queen as either inappropriate or politically dangerous. She was surrounded by people who served her out of duty rather than affection, who watched her for signs of weakness or foreign influence rather than offering the companionship and support she desperately needed. The contrast with her French life became a source of constant pain. Mary had left behind friends who genuinely cared for her, advisors who valued her opinion, and a cultural environment where her intelligence and accomplishments were appreciated. In Scotland, she found herself isolated among people who viewed her foreign education as a liability and her French connections as evidence of divided loyalty. Her attempts to recreate some of the cultural life she had enjoyed in France met with resistance from Protestant leaders who viewed music, dancing, and artistic pursuits as frivolous distractions from religious duty. The court entertainments that had been central to Mary's French experience were condemned as papist corruptions that threatened the moral purity of Scotland. Even her love of poetry and literature was suspect in a culture that increasingly viewed any learning beyond biblical study as potentially dangerous. Mary's marriage prospects became another source of frustration and political manipulation. Every potential suitor was evaluated not for his compatibility with Mary as a person, but for his usefulness in advancing various political agendas. Protestant lords wanted her to marry someone who would strengthen their control over the kingdom, while Catholic powers pushed for alliances that would restore Scotland to the old faith. Mary herself, having experienced one loveless political marriage, desperately wanted to find a partner who might offer her some personal happiness as well as political advantage. The pressure to remarry quickly was intense, as everyone understood that Mary's ability to produce heirs was crucial to Scotland's political stability. But every potential match carried enormous risks that could either strengthen or destroy her already precarious position. A Catholic husband would alienate Protestant subjects, while a Protestant marriage would be seen as betrayal by Catholic powers. A Scottish noble would be viewed with suspicion by other nobles, while a foreign prince would confirm fears about Mary's divided loyalties. The young woman who had been promised in marriage as an infant, engaged as a child, and widowed as a teenager, now faced the prospect of another politically motivated union that would serve everyone's interests except her own. Her romantic desires, her personal preferences, and her emotional needs were completely irrelevant to the calculations of men who viewed her primarily as a means of advancing their own ambitions. Mary's health began to deteriorate under the stress of her impossible situation. The young woman who had thrived in the stimulating environment of the French court found herself frequently ill in Scotland, suffering from what contemporary physicians called melancholy, but what we might recognize as severe depression. She experienced fainting spells, digestive problems, and periods of such emotional distress that she was unable to perform her royal duties. These health problems were dismissed by her Scottish advisors as evidence of feminine weakness or French softness, but they were actually symptoms of the psychological trauma she was experiencing as she tried to reconcile her French identity with her Scottish responsibilities. Mary was being torn apart by competing loyalties, impossible expectations, and the growing realization that she might never be able to successfully rule the kingdom she had inherited as an infant. The young queen's letters from this period reveal a woman struggling with profound loneliness and cultural displacement. She wrote to her former companions in France with desperate nostalgia, describing Scotland as a cold, harsh country where she felt like a stranger among her own people. Her correspondence reveals someone who was gradually coming to understand that her childhood exile, which had been intended to save her throne, had actually made her unfit to occupy it. Mary's attempts to govern effectively were hampered by her incomplete understanding of Scottish law, customs, and political traditions. The education that had prepared her to be Queen of France had left her ignorant of the specific knowledge she needed to rule Scotland successfully. She was forced to rely on advisors who often had their own agendas and who sometimes deliberately misled her about important matters of policy and tradition. The young woman who had been raised to believe in the divine right of kings discovered that in Scotland, royal authority was conditional and constantly contested. Her subjects felt free to disobey her commands, ignore her policies, and openly criticize her decisions in ways that would have been unthinkable in France. The absolute power she had expected to wield was revealed to be an illusion, maintained only as long as it served the interests of others. As Mary's second year in Scotland progressed, it became clear that her return had not solved the problems created by her childhood exile, but had instead created new and more complex difficulties. She was caught between competing demands that could not be reconciled. She was expected to be Scottish, but not too Scottish, Catholic, but not too Catholic, independent, but not too independent. Every choice she made alienated some faction while failing to satisfy any completely. The tragic irony of Mary's situation was becoming apparent even to her enemies. The child who had been sent away to preserve her throne had grown into a woman whose foreign education made her incapable of effectively occupying that throne. The protection that had saved her from English conquest had created a different but equally serious threat to her ability to rule Scotland successfully. Mary's story was entering its most dangerous phase, as the political skills she had learned in France proved inadequate for the brutal realities of Scottish politics. The young queen who had survived the machinations of the French court was about to discover that her own subjects could be far more dangerous enemies than any foreign power. Her tragic childhood had prepared her for many things, but it had not prepared her for the possibility that the kingdom she had been born to rule might ultimately destroy her. The seeds of Mary's eventual downfall were already being planted in these early years of her personal rule, as she struggled to navigate challenges that her upbringing had left her uniquely unqualified to handle. The little girl who had been crowned at 9 months old was about to learn that surviving to claim her inheritance was only the beginning of her troubles, not the end of them.